She saw the Christ uplifted upon Calvary. She saw the earth wrapped in darkness. And she heard the mysterious cry, "It is finished." Not "it is written," but "it is finished." Still another scene met her gaze. She saw Christ seated upon the great white cloud, while the earth reeled in space. Can I read the part again? She saw Christ seated upon the great white cloud, while the earth reeled in space, and his murderers fled from his glory, including her husband. With a cry of horror, she awoke and at once wrote to Pilate, her husband, words of warning. "Nihil tibi et juster illi, multa in impasta sum hodie, per visum propter eum." Or if you prefer, as is found in Matthew 27:19, "Have nothing to do with this righteous man, for I have suffered many things today in a dream about him." The dream of Pilate's wife. But first of all, though, affirmation of faith. We are here gathered for the purpose of worship, and we need our faith to be developed, grounded solidly, and progressive towards eternity. 5 statements, 2 from the Bible, should I say 3 from the Bible, and 2 from the supportive information in the spirit of prophecy. This one is on the promises of God. Deuteronomy 7:6, "The Lord thy God hath chosen thee to be a special people unto himself, above all the people upon the face of the earth." Not a people who are a minority facing, daily dealing with inferiority complex in a world that is larger, but a special people before the Lord. Testimonies to Ministers 381, "The promises of God are full and abundant. To all that call upon him, God is near to help and sustain." Back to the Bible again, Jeremiah, "I have loved thee, says God, with an everlasting love." My Life Today, 260, "There is no reason for discouragement. The promises of God are sure and steadfast." And the 5th statement, Joshua 1:9, "The Lord thy God is with thee, whithersoever thou goest." And then we look at the signs of the times before the destruction of Jerusalem. I am reading now from Great Controversy 7 prophetic statements regarding the signs of the times before the destruction of Jerusalem. Remember, these are 7. They are found in Great Controversy. We'll have a comparison with some other writings in a moment. This is what it says. Before the destruction of Jerusalem, unmistakable signs would precede the awful climax. For nearly 40 years after the doom of Jerusalem had been pronounced by Christ himself, that's Matthew 24, the Lord delayed his judgments upon that city and upon the nation. This new generation had not enjoyed the opportunities, nor had they received the light that their parents had spurned. In their hatred and their cruelty toward the disciples of Jesus, they thus rejected the last offer of mercy. Signs and wonders appeared, foreboding disaster and doom. 1, let me read these in consecutive order. 1, in the midst of the night, an unnatural light shone over the temple and the altar. 2, upon the clouds at sunset were pictured chariots and men of war gathering for battle. Can you picture that? Upon the clouds at sunset were pictured chariots and men of war gathering for battle. 3, the priests ministering by night in the sanctuary were terrified by mysterious sounds. 4, the earth trembled. 5, and a multitude of voices were heard crying, Ichabod, let us depart hence. 6, the great eastern gate opened at midnight without visible aid. And I take another page and read the 7th sign, and this is what it says. For 7 years a man continued to go up and down the streets of Jerusalem, declaring the woes that were to come upon that city. By day and by night he chanted a wild dirge. So in summary so far, we have read the information regarding the dream of Pilate's wife. Affirmation of faith, the promises of God. And the third item, the signs of the times before the destruction of Jerusalem. Our topic for the day, the dream of Pilate's wife. However, let's go back to the beginning of the Hebrew era. Way back in ancient times, 1,500 years, 1,500 years before the time of Jesus. As the elder read 2 scriptures, one from the Old Testament, one from the New, this is referring to the call of God's people out of Egypt into the promised land. God is giving a call to his people in the world of today, ultimately into the promised land. And we are part of that great congress of people, and we are part of the vehicle that is spreading that information. Hosea 11:1, right at the beginning, says, when Israel was a child, Greek and in Latin history, depending on which language you prefer to read it in, as Senkeres or Concaris. Then God called Moses at the burning bush, Exodus 3:10. You know that verse. The children hear about that in the children's story, in the worship service, and in the Sabbath school lesson. And he says, I will send thee unto Pharaoh. You know what happened. There was the plagues of Egypt, other things that took place. And then I read again, at the time of the Exodus. This is taken from Patriarchs and Prophets, Story of Redemption, and some other writings collectively assembled into interesting information. At the beginning of the Exodus, the Lord directed Moses and the children of Israel to turn aside into a rocky defile and to encamp beside the sea. This is right at the beginning. In Egypt, the report was spread that the children of Israel were pressing on towards the Red Sea. All 2,500,000 of them. Can you imagine trying to assemble that multitude? Pharaoh collected his forces, and the king himself headed the attacking army. The Hebrews were encamped beside the sea, whose waters presented a seemingly impassable barrier before them, while on the south a rugged mountain obstructed their further progress. Now you can see that location on Google Earth. It's quite obvious. The king took a very large army and 600 chariots, and he pursued after them and overtook them while they were encamped by the sea. Suddenly, the children of Israel beheld in the distance the flashing armor and moving chariots, betokening the advance guard of a great army. Reading from the Bible, Exodus chapter 14, verse 21. The Lord caused to go back by a strong east wind all that night. And he made the sea, or the floor of the sea, as dry land. And the waters were divided. As Moses stretched out his rod, the waters parted, and Israel went into the midst of the sea upon dry ground, while the waters stood like a wall upon each side. The light from God's pillar of fire shone upon foam-capped billows and lighted the road that was cut like a mighty furrow through the waters of the sea. The thunders pealed and the lightnings flashed. The waters rose up and stood like a congealed wall on either side while Israel walked in the midst of the sea on dry ground. Another statement. The waters parted, rolling up into a wall on either side and leaving a broad pathway across the bed of the sea for the children of Israel. The light from that pillar of fire shone upon the foam-capped billows, lighting the road that was cut like a mighty furrow through the waters of the Red Sea, the bitter lake. Story of Redemption 124. In the morning, as the Egyptian host came upon the sea, lo, there was a dry pathway before them. The waters were divided and stood like a wall upon either side. And the children of Israel were halfway through the sea, walking on dry land. The Egyptians dared to venture into the path that God had prepared for his people. And the angels of God went through their host and removed their chariot wheels. The Egyptians became terribly afraid and were turning about to flee from the Israelites and go back to the shore. Amid the wrath of the elements, another statement, in which they heard the voice of an angry God, the Egyptians endeavored to retrace their steps and to flee back to the shore that they had just quitted. Moses stretched out his rod, and the piled up waters, hissing, roaring, rushed together and swallowed up the entire Egyptian army in their black depths. Another statement, the wheels of the chariots sink deep into the soft sand, and the horses become entangled and unruly. The thunders roll, the lightnings flash, the waves roll down about them. Confusion and dismay seizes the Egyptians. The piled up waters, hissing, roaring, tumble down upon them. Proud Pharaoh and his legions are engulfed beneath a stormy sea. The embanked waters that had stood as a great wall rolled on in their natural course. Of all the men in that vast Egyptian army, not one escaped. Not even Pharaoh. His half-brother was the one who took over the throne. We know him as Thutmose IV. Now, that is the beginning of the Hebrew era, way back there in ancient Egypt. Children of Abraham multiplied in Egypt. God says, I called my son, whom I loved, out of Egypt. That was the Exodus. He established them in the promised land. And they went their willful ways anyway, like human beings are wont to do. We come now to the end of the Hebrew era, 1,500 years later. And we are now at the trials of Jesus. You might remember that the writings tell us, if you numerically look at this information this way, that there were 7 trials that Jesus went through. 1 through 7. And we are now looking at the 7th trial, which is in Pilate's Praetorium. This is a model of Pilate's Praetorium in Jerusalem. We've been there, we've seen it. And on this particular occasion, back nearly 2,000 years ago, when Jesus was on trial before Pilate, it was in this location, and this was the occasion when Pilate's wife had a dream. Claudia Procula was of royal blood. She was a granddaughter of Augustus Caesar. And at the time when this experience took place, she was still a young wife. The dream occurred just around daylight on Friday morning, April 6, in the year 31 AD. Let me read again some of this interesting information. When Jesus was on trial on this particular occasion, this is some of the information that took place, Desire of Ages tells us. Demons themselves, in human form, were in the crowd. And what could be expected but the answer, let him be crucified, let him be crucified. When Pilate, that is the husband of Claudia Procula, when Pilate declared himself innocent of the blood of Christ, When Pilate declared himself innocent of the blood of Christ, Caiaphas answered defiantly, his blood be upon us and upon our children. That those awful words were taken up by the priests and the rulers and echoed by the crowd in an inhuman voice of roar of voices. His blood be upon us and upon our children. The whole multitude answered, and they said, his blood be upon us and upon our children. Matthew 27:25 gives you those words in English. They cry them out in Aramaic. His blood upon us and upon our children, it is stated in the English version, Matthew 27:25. That awful cry ascended to the throne of God. That sentence pronounced upon themselves was written in heaven. That prayer was heard. Terribly, it was realized in the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, I read on in this information that God gave many signs and mercy and indications in his great mercy. Do you remember a while earlier, perhaps quarter of an hour earlier, I referred to 7 signs that were written in the book Great Controversy. These signs that were given to the people of Jerusalem in advance of the destruction of that wonderful city. Great Controversy 25. Unmistakable signs would precede that awful climax. The dreaded hour would come suddenly and swiftly. However, there were still among the Jews who were ignorant of the character and the work of Christ some of these people. And in addition, the children had not enjoyed the opportunities, nor had they received the light which their parents had spurned a generation or two earlier at the time of Christ's crucifixion. However, all the predictions given by Jesus were fulfilled to the letter. Now I read another set of writings, this time from the Jewish historian Josephus. And interestingly, he writes 10 signs, most of which are given in the book Great Controversy anyway. And so I read here what he says. If you have the book of Josephus, so hard to find their locations in the indexes that are given, but in the common popular version, it's page 582 in the book of Josephus. Double columns on the page, it's the left-hand column that you can read, 582. This is what Josephus says, and I'm using his words, not as he wrote in the original language, but as that is translated into the English that we understand. 1, there was a star resembling a sword which stood over the city. 2, and a comet that continued a whole year. 3, at the 9th hour of the night, so great a light shone around the altar and the temple that it appeared to be a bright daytime, and this lasted for half an hour. 4, a heifer, a young cow, as she was led by the high priest to be sacrificed, brought forth a lamb. 5, the eastern gate of the temple, very heavy, which took 20 men to close, was seen to open of its own accord about the 6th hour of the night. 6, before sunset, chariots and clouds and troops of soldiers in their armor were seen running among the clouds. 7, they felt a great quaking, an earthquake. 8, they heard a great noise. 9, after that they heard a sound of a great multitude saying, let us remove hence. Ichabod. 10, there was a man who began to cry aloud, a voice from the east, a voice from the west, a voice from the four winds, a voice against Jerusalem, in his language, not ours. He continued this woeful dirge for 7 years and 5 months. God in his mercy sent a lot of signs to those people living back there in ancient Jerusalem. Most of the people did not heed these things, but there were some who understood the signs of the times, and they left the area of that city before the destruction of the locality took place under the Roman legions. Now, in our world of today, God has given signs. Perhaps on a coming occasion we can look at some of these signs again and we can see the application and the implication of all of these things. However, as we know from Jewish history, as we know from ancient Roman history, the legions of Rome under Titus, who became a Caesar himself later, they overwhelmed the city of Jerusalem, conquered it, destroyed it, and they killed many people, and they led others into slavery. Great Controversy gives us on page 31 a listing, 2 or 3 pages of it, of what took place under the destruction of the city of Jerusalem. But I ask you a question: how much horror do you want? Read it for yourself if you would like to. Page 31, Great Controversy. I have taken out some of the information in brief statements instead of whole paragraphs. I'll read some of these to you. Millions of Jews assembled in Jerusalem for the Passover celebration. Food supplies were almost totally destroyed by infighting. Some of the people chewed leather belts and leather sandals in their hunger. Some of them would creep out at night to try to find food, but they would be taken, tortured, crucified, killed. I mention this quietly. It is known that there were cases of cannibalism. The temple was stormed, and one of the soldiers took a brand, you can read this in Great Controversy, threw it into the temple building itself, and soon it was on fire. And we read that the whole hilltop blazed like a volcano. Thousands of people were crucified, so many that it was difficult to walk between the crosses outside of the city of Jerusalem. More than 1 million people were killed, and multi-thousands were taken as prisoners of war into slavery around the Roman Empire. We can be aware of the terrible events that took place in that nation. They left their allegiance to divinity, and when their time came, destruction was the involvement. It's interesting to note a simple sentence in the destruction of Jerusalem. And what actually happened was that the Roman general who was commanding the situation suddenly called off the attack on Jerusalem. They went down into Egypt to fight a threatened invasion down there. And while the Jews were pursuing the Roman soldiers down towards Egypt, all of the Christians took this as the sign to leave Jerusalem before its destruction. And as a result of that, Great Controversy 30 says very clearly, not one Christian perished in the destruction of Jerusalem. God had his eyes over his people. Do you not remember the two statements that the elder read in the scripture reading? That God loved his people, God loved his son and called him out of Egypt. This had an application to the life of Jesus. Jesus went down into Egypt as a child. No, he was taken down there as an infant. And then he was brought out again. And that verse of scripture applied to the life of Jesus as well. In the application of this information for God's people in the last days, God is calling his people out of Egypt. Many others will join us in the events of the end. It doesn't look that way at the present time, but this is the way it will go and what will happen. And soon after those events, then there are a series of other events that take place under last day events, as we call it. And God cares for his people, and he protects them in all of these things. Great Controversy 22. Jesus saw in Jerusalem a symbol of the world hardened in unbelief and rebellion. The Savior's prophecy concerning the visitation of judgment upon Jerusalem is to have another fulfillment. Matthew 24. of which the terrible desolation back then is but a faint shadow of what is coming. In the fate of that chosen city, we may behold the doom of a world that has rejected God's mercy and trampled upon His law. You know that. 10 Commandments are valid today. The Sabbath is valid today. You are keeping the Sabbath. You are observing the day of rest and worship. And many of you are witnessing before the Lord amongst family, friends, community, and the workplace and so on. In the fate of that chosen city, we may behold the doom of a world that has rejected God's mercy and trampled upon His law. Now, way back at the beginning of the Advent movement, these things were way off in the future. You know that I was not brought up as an Adventist. I have made the statement that in looking back, I was just an ordinary secular guy. But the more I study the Bible and the spirit of prophecy and God's ministry of salvation, the more I tend to change, to modify that statement and state that maybe way back then, before my things of faith, I was a little less than ordinary. And maybe some of you in looking back would say similar things about yourself. But way back then, all of these things were in the future. We are now living in an era when we are viewing these things as being on the horizon. And the difficulties that have come in this country, and the crime level, and the disasters. Canada gets their share, as well as Texas and California and Oklahoma and New Orleans and a lot of other places. It's not going to get better. It is going to get worse. However, we can be assured that God's protection is with His people. In the destruction of the city of Jerusalem, horrible though it was, there was not one Christian that perished in that situation. We are the apple of the eye of divinity, and God protects and cares for us as we are obedient to Him. And in the events of the end, when they get worse and still worser and still worsest, if I can use words that are not found in the dictionary, nor in the school curriculum, thank you, we realize that God is with His people. Let me read from the Bible. Matthew 24:13. He that shall endure unto the end shall be saved. So it's simple enough. You just continue on in the ways of faith. Reading the Bible, reading the good books, praying, obeying, and witnessing. In that day, as in the time of Jerusalem's destruction, God's people will be delivered. In the time of trouble, just before the coming of Jesus, the righteous will be preserved through the ministration of heavenly angels. It is at midnight that God manifests His power for the deliverance of His people. Now, I mentioned a little earlier that there were signs of the times before the destruction of Jerusalem. And there was a new generation that had come on the scene, maybe 2 generations from the time when Jesus lived and died, was resurrected, and then ascended. Maybe a generation or 2 generations. God gave a repetition of the signs, nay, He gave new signs for those people. Now, with the Advent people, the Advent movement, way back in the 1700s, 1800s, there were signs of the times that are listed in the Bible and in our writings. We're going to see some remarkable things taking place in our world yet to come. Maybe on another occasion I'll have the opportunity of presenting some of this information in these ways. But even though we despair at what we observe in the secular world regarding the tragedies and crime level and problems, yet we can be aware that God is protecting His people. I think I need to read these statements again. Matthew 24:13. He that shall endure unto the end shall be saved. In that day, as in the time of Jerusalem's destruction, God's people will be delivered. In the time of trouble, just before the coming of Jesus, the righteous will be preserved through the ministry of heavenly angels. It is at midnight that God manifests His power for the deliverance of His people. So what is our responsibility? I don't know. But maybe it might be what the General Conference President says, like I read a little earlier, and like maybe I should read again at the conclusion of our information on this particular occasion. Page 16, nay, I'll leave that one to last. Page 19, it says here, in the words of the General Conference President, we are facing a crisis. It is about the Bible. Do Seventh-day Adventists consider the Bible to be God's Word? Or do we think it is just a collection of nice recommendations and sayings? Good chapter to read. Then on page 29, it says here, search the Scriptures daily. And then I read the first statement last, and this is found on page 16, and this is what it says here in this information regarding the events of the end. On page 16, soon we will see a small dark cloud, quoting from the Old Testament, quoting from the modern day writings. Soon we will see a small dark cloud about half the size of a man's hand. It will grow larger and larger and brighter until it fills the whole sky. That cloud will be composed of billions of angels with the very real Jesus Christ, the one who died for us all, seated right in the center. All heaven has come to see in person the victory that God has won. Our victory, this is what will be the center of the universe from this time onwards. We come to the end of our information in our worship service, and we'll sing number 573, and we will leave some of this information suspended to be presented in coming occasions. But as we sing this, I'm sure that it will echo in our lives and in our hearts. I'll go where you want me to go. I'll do what you want me to do, Lord. Let us sing 573 in this way.
Let us stand.